Now, this first story I call Pete and the M-80. Back when I was a kid, there was one form of entertainment that never failed to excite and amuse us: fireworks. You can't get real fireworks anymore, at least not here in Kentucky. All you can buy now are those little sparkly, fizzy, smoky things that are about as exciting as watching the grass grow. Yes, I know we want to ensure safety for the kiddies. So we pass laws prohibiting fireworks and then make guns as easy to get as popsicles. Go figure. Anyway, back in those days, you could get a real bang for your buck. Now, the two big bangers of choice were the cherry bomb, which was about the size of a cherry and bright red, the fuse being about an inch long, and the M-80, which was cylindrical, maybe 2 inches long, and had the fuse coming out of the middle instead of at the end. Now, they may have come in different colors, but the ones I remember were silver. Now, these were no ordinary firecrackers. Take about an eighth of a stick of dynamite, set it off, and you have a rough idea of what we were playing with. You know, maybe those do-gooder laws aren't such a bad idea after all. Well, you could blow a tin can 30 feet in the air with one, and loud, every head in the neighborhood would turn when you set one of those babies off. We, of course, found very inventive ways of blowing up various parts of our environs. Some unsavories, who shall go unnamed, even fished with them. Go to the right hole of water, and you could bring up 20 bluegill at a time with a couple of bass thrown in. But perhaps our favorite pastime was making movies. Now, no one at that time had ever heard of George Lucas or Steven Spielberg, but that did not deter us from our cinematic pursuits and crude attempts at special effects. We found it was great fun to tape an M-80 to a plastic model and then watch it disintegrate. We started with model cars, progressed to airplanes, and finally to model ships, which cinematically were the most fun. There was a lake nearby which served nicely as our special effects tank. We would fill the hull with lighter fluid or gasoline, tape a cherry bomb or M-80 to the hull, light it, and push it out into the water. With our little brownie camera rolling, there would follow a tremendous explosion. The ship would disappear in a fireball, sometimes reaching 25 feet. Never failed to bring a grin to our faces to see the carnage that we wrought and imagine what the finished effect would look like on film. And before you ask, none of us wound up as criminals, terrorists, or mail bombers. Well, maybe I presume, for there are a few of that illustrious group with whom I have lost touch, and admittedly I don't check the post office wall on a regular basis. Well, one of this group was a kid named Pete. Now, Pete was an otherwise relatively intelligent personage, but one prone to the "hey, watch this" syndrome. His dad was chief of police of our fair town, which perhaps explains why Pete always seemed to be testing the limits of his own mischievousness and everyone else's patience. I once saw him do a double gainer into what I swear couldn't have been more than 18 inches of water. He came up spitting mud and swearing like a sailor, but otherwise unharmed. He seemed to lead a somewhat charmed life, but then I guess all of us did some things that by rights should have killed us right then and there. Well, if Pete did have a guardian angel, then I'm sure that by the time he reached high school, that angel had probably suffered at least 3 nervous breakdowns and become heavily Prozac dependent. The Pete episode that sticks out most in my mind involved Pete, an M-80, and the town sewer system. Now, back then, it was common practice for small towns to combine their sanitary and storm sewers into one main line. This made for some interesting smells along Main Street on hot July days. It also meant that during heavy rains, raw sewage was being dumped into nearby Triplet Creek, the same Triplet Creek where we fished, swam, and where the town got its drinking water. But these were pre-EPA days, and so we all sort of lived in a blissful ignorance. We played baseball in a field across from our house. Home plate was near one corner of the field, and the street ran close by. Now, all too often, a foul ball or wild pitch would wind up rolling into the street and just as often into the sewer. If the weather had been dry for a few days, this posed only the problem of reaching through the sewer grate and grabbing the ball. If there had been rain lately, however, some brave soul would have to stick his hand into that dark, wet, and smelly abyss and retrieve the horsehide. Then came a hosing off of the ball and perhaps a day or two in the sun before the smell would dissipate enough so it could be used again. Hey, we weren't rich, you know, and those balls cost 50 cents apiece. Well, so one afternoon there we were, about 6 or 8 of us, playing ball. Pete fouled one off, and sure enough, it rolled right into the sewer. It had been about a day or two since it had rained, but that wasn't enough for the sewer to have dried out. Now, it was the unwritten rule that if you were responsible for the ball going into the sewer, you were the one who had to retrieve it. Pete took a look through the grate that covered the opening in the curb and determined that the ball had rolled beyond his reach. "Can't get it," he uttered. "Too far back." "Now, wait a minute," responded Louie. "That's my ball, and it's almost new. I've only had it a month or two." "Ah, the seams are busted and the stuffing's coming out," pronounced Pete. "Anybody got another ball?" Well, no one did, so after a round of recrimination and cajoling, it once again fell onto Pete's shoulders to reclaim the lost sphere. "But how can I get it if I can't reach it?" he pleaded. Then, of a sudden, a look of sheer inspiration swept over his face. "I've got it," he shouted, producing an M-80 from his pocket. "I'll throw this on the back side of the ball and blow it back to us." Now, the rest of us sort of glanced at each other with that, "uh-oh, here comes another watch this" look. "It'll be okay, I'm telling you," implored Pete, lighting the fuse and throwing it far back into the sewer. The rest of us instinctively backed away as Pete stood looking into the grate, waiting for the ball to be delivered unto him. Now, none of us had ever heard of sewer gas. I think methane is the correct chemical name, but by whatever name you call it, it's a highly explosive gas that's produced by sewage, and that sewer was full of it. The sewers back then had a circular lid which was recessed into the sidewalk above the sewer grate. Those suckers were heavy, about 40 or 50 pounds apiece. Now, my first recollection of the explosion was that manhole cover being blown into the air, flipping over and over like a nickel being flipped for heads or tails, crossing the street in the air and landing with a thump on the pitcher's mound of the ball field. At the same moment, there was a tremendous whoomph, and a fireball shot out of that sewer, completely enveloping Pete for one frightening moment. I remember hearing the manhole covers from a block away falling back onto the street with resounding clangs as the explosion had ripped through every sewer line in the east side of town, blowing manhole covers left and right. One lady even phoned the police, reporting that the Russians were attacking Morehead. Well, when the smoke cleared, there stood Pete, his hair and clothes still smoking, sewage covering every part of his body. His eyebrows were gone completely, and the hair on his head was burned about halfway back. Now, actually, the sewage probably saved him, because that vile-smelling muck was wet and therefore doused the flames before they could affect any real serious burns. Well, once we ascertained that he was still both standing and breathing, we crowded around and began congratulating him on his unique and spectacular pyrotechnics display. But Pete began a nervous dance, perhaps from shock, or perhaps because he could already anticipate his impending doom. "Oh, God, Dad's gonna kill me. Oh, God, he's gonna kill me," was all he would utter as he danced around. It was then that a police car turned the corner at the far end of the street, and we all scattered. It was every man for himself. We all laid low that day. I spent most of the day in my room, reading comics, sure that at any moment the police would burst in to arrest me. Pete came by that evening and asked if I would go home with him. He'd hidden out in the woods north of town and only now had worked up the courage to go home. "Are you going to tell him?" I asked. "Are you kidding?" he responded. "Do I look like I want to die young? I'm going to deny knowing anything about it, no matter what." So up we trudged onto his front porch and opened the screen door. "Maybe it'll be okay," he whispered. "Maybe I can just sneak up to my room." But the words were no sooner out of his mouth than his father's voice boomed from the living room, "Pete, come in here." We exchanged glances, and I must admit the thought of a hasty retreat ran through my mind, but Pete looked like the proverbial dead man walking, so we both hesitantly crept through the doorway. Now, Pete's dad was always an imposing figure, but tonight especially so, since he was still wearing his chief's uniform. His voice always sounded authoritative, but this evening it took on the graveness of the Grim Reaper. We stood directly in front of him. He ignored yours truly, which was perfectly all right by me. I tried my best to melt further into the floor as he addressed his wayward son. "Pete, you know anything about those manhole covers being blown off today?" You know, sometimes even policemen can belabor the obvious. I mean, here stood Pete, dried sewage all over him, smelling to high heaven, and the hair burned half off his head. His dad had to know he was either involved with the sewer incident or else he had encountered a fire-breathing dragon which had also decided to crap on him as well. Well, to my utter amazement, though, Pete conjured up his most innocent look and voice, and while wiping some of the offending sewage from the side of his face, responded with, "Who? Me, Dad? No, I don't know a thing about it." Well, it was about this time that I was asked to leave, and I was only too happy to oblige. A few days later, Pete described in great detail the whipping that he'd gotten. When he was finished, he looked at us, a smile crossed his lips, and he breathed nostalgically, 57 manhole covers. Wish I'd had a camera. You know, we never did find Louie's ball.